Good morning.
Good morning.
We are very fortunate to have Stephen Cushman. Stephen is the Robert C. Taylor Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He is a specialist in American literature and poetry. And Dr. Cushman did his undergraduate work at Cornell and his graduate work at Yale. He has published several books and dozens of articles. The Civil War book that you are probably familiar with, I thought you should pick it up. It's quite good. Bloody Promenade. Bloody Promenade. It is a reflective book on the Battle of the Wilderness. Right now, Stephen's going to give us some insights into his current project on Ambrose Bierce and the Battle of Chickamauga. Steve.
Thank you very much, Pete. Just doing a sound check. Am I too close? Right about right from the mic? Does that sound okay over there in the back? Good? Okay, thank you. My wife says my voice is too big. I feel very fortunate to be here, and I'm going to try and do my part to hold up what's been fantastic so far. I know this is a Gettysburg crowd, and it's a little strange to be perhaps talking about Chickamauga here in such detail about the ground, but I know that Keith Bohannon gave you a crash course in the war in the West, and I have some stuff for you too that will give you some quick spark notes, monkey notes. My hope is that what I have to say about the ground of Chickamauga, one particular part of the ground, and its significance to the writing of history about that battle, is transferable to this ground and the writing about this battle or any. And I know you're interested in the ground because I walked last night with many of you through Pickett's Ticks. The particular ground I'm going to be talking about is Horseshoe Ridge on the second day of Chickamauga, September 20, 1863, another sesquicentennial anniversary. And I think a reasonable analogy for those of you who are not as familiar with Chickamauga as you are with Gettysburg is that Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill are to Chickamauga roughly what Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top are to this battle. Obviously, very different outcomes. That was a Confederate victory. This was not. But in both cases, a successfully defended Union position against a failed Confederate attack. And before I start, I'm just going to give you a little context so you don't feel that this talk about a literary figure is coming to you from Mars. I'm going to talk about Ambrose Bierce, who does double duty in our memories as both a soldier. So many writers about the Civil War weren't, those who have gone on to become literary figures in the American literary canon. He was a soldier, he was a first lieutenant, and for purposes of my talk, especially important, he was a topographic engineer charged with mapping and scouting ground for his superior, Hazen, whom he very much admired. He was from Indiana, born 1842, died we don't know when, because he disappeared into Mexico following, tried to cover the Mexican Revolution, was never heard from. If you know Bierce at all, you probably know a short story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is his most famous thing, often anthologized. Another just deliciously evil book is his Devil's Dictionary. And you can treat yourself to that. That's a very slim book. What this is, what you're going to hear, is a section from a chapter on Bierce, which is in turn a section of a book I've just finished. And the book I've just finished is called Belligerent Muse. Belligerent Muse, 5 Northern narrators in the American Civil War. And my 5 are Lincoln, Walt Whitman, Sherman, Ambrose Bierce, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And the point of that book is this. Historical writing about the Civil War, when it's done by people who are very self-conscious about their powers as writers, is also art. It is also art. Never forget that there was a Greek muse of history, Clio. So sometimes it makes historians uncomfortable, but the writing of history is a literary art and has been from the beginning. And the vision of history that we get from the writing of people who are self-conscious about their powers as writers is not clear glass on the past. You cannot look through the writing of, say, Sherman and see the past as though you're looking through clear glass. Their writing is always stained glass. And I'm interested in that staining. I'm interested in how that happens and its effects. So in Bierce's case, the issue that I'm going to try to interest you in is this. He was a first-hand witness of events on Horseshoe Ridge, September 20th, 1863. And many people think that fact, that he was a first-hand witness, automatically gives him a kind of authority and credibility. And I want to poke at that authority and that credibility a little bit in the first part of what I'm going to say. And then in the second part of what I'm going to say, I want to talk about how he was also, in addition to being a first-hand witness, he was also a retrospective narrator, starting in the late 1880s. And it was when he became a retrospective narrator that he worked to establish and consolidate another kind of authority, another kind of credibility. And I want to talk about how he did that. The last thing you have, by way of introduction, is there's a nifty handout, which is in a stack back there. I hope you picked it up on the way in. It's 2 pages, and it's there for you. It's sort of like on the airplane when the oxygen mask drops down. If you find yourself nodding off, just reach for the handout and you'll come back quickly. I've given you some juicy things. Top left of the first page of the handout, I guess page 2 of the handout, is a wonderful definition from the Devil's Dictionary, in this case of the word valor. And you can have a look at that. It makes a reference to Chickamauga. Then you're going to see a little excerpt from a letter that he wrote to a young female disciple of his, Blanche Partington. You'll get to see her names. You can write that down, or you don't have to write that down. It's right here. You can take a photograph of it and put it in your iPod, or I don't know how those things work. What do? You photograph it, and there it is. Then you're going to hear about this guy, Lucian, who was a classical writer of history that Bierce admired. Then you have a bunch of names of people I'm going to mention, but there are the full bibliographic citations. Then there is a little piece of the official record, the OR, that I'm going to talk about. And finally, there are your cliff notes, spark notes, monkey notes about the Battle of Chickamauga if you're rusty. All right, that's it by way of intro. August 1892, Ambrose Bierce wrote Blanche Partington, one of his disciples, a letter in which he insistently identified his own voice with truthfulness. And this is what he says. The love of truth is good enough motive for me when I wrote of my fellow men. This insistence on his own disinterested truthfulness anticipated that of Archibald Gracie, refer to your handout. Archibald Gracie, who was the author of a painstakingly researched study, The Truth About Chickamauga, published in 1911. What makes these two versions of self-proclaimed truthfulness something more than mere coincidence is that Bierce corresponded with Gracie during the writing of Gracie's book. And their correspondence, from which really only one item has received any appreciable attention from Bierce scholars, is worth a closer look. Who was Gracie? Gracie was son of Confederate Brigadier General Archibald Gracie Jr., who who commanded Gracie's brigade of Preston's division, of Buckner's corps, of Longstreet's left wing of Bragg's army of Tennessee, and who was later killed at Petersburg. The younger Gracie, the son, makes clear from the outset of his book about Chickamauga that he's a man on a mission, and that his mission is to, and I'm quoting now, show how the history of Chickamauga has ever, since the day it was fought, been made a conspiracy for the silencing and suppression of truth. That word keeps coming back like a refrain, truth. According to Gracie, this historiographic conspiracy includes, I'm quoting again, the fact that the Confederate soldiers' testimony was thus thrown out and no attempt made to reconcile his statements with the truth. Anyone reading only this far in Gracie's book could be excused for anticipating that an author who is the son of a Confederate general, who is lamenting the suppression of Confederate testimony, has probably written a book tipping the balance back toward a Confederate perspective. Especially when a few pages later you find out that the person he's mad at, he's interested in, and this name also appears on your handout, the heart of this hydra-headed monster of untruth comes from the newspaper writings and similar publications of Colonel Henry V. Boynton, who at Chickamauga commanded the 35th Ohio, 3rd Brigade, 3rd Division of Thomas's 14th Army Corps. Just a note, if you know the history of Sherman's memoirs, you know that Boynton was the author of a book called Sherman's Historical Raid on the Truth. So Boynton's a spoiler all along, it seems. But even though you might think that the younger Gracie is writing a pro-Confederate book, in fact, he turns out to be a truer student of the truth. And his book contains fold-out maps that anticipate by decades Peter Cousins', also on your handout, later designation of the three hills comprising Horseshoe Ridge at Chickamauga as numbers 1, 2, and 3, although Cousins does not credit Gracie with this designation. Gracie undertook to correct Boynton, who was himself the author of the National Military Park, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Historical Guide, 1895, first book about Chickamauga, first book about the park there, and who was also called upon to be the superintendent there, the first superintendent at Chickamauga. Gracie was angry because he had decided from looking at the records that what Boynton had done was to try to distract attention from units that actually deserved a lot of credit at Chickamauga. And Gracie, was going to work very hard consulting the recently released The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records, which, of course, for us is bedside reading. Probably we'll have it in our sarcophagi when we're embalmed. You know, publication started in 1890 and had just finished in 1901. According to Gracie, Boynton's chief fault was that he didn't look at the OR. Now, among the units receiving considerable attention from Gracie were the 9th Indiana, Bierce's own original regiment, in Hazen's 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division of Crittenden's 21st Army Corps. Also receiving considerable attention from Gracie was the Ohio Light Artillery, 18th Battery belonging to the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of Granger's Reserve Corps. What's interesting for us about this battery is it was the battery that included Lieutenant Albert Bierce. That's Bierce's brother, his immediately older sibling in a family of 13 children, the last 3 of whom did not survive childhood. So there are these two brothers, these two Bierce brothers, corresponding with Gracie about Chickamauga. And in his preface, Gracie thanked surviving comrades of the Army of the Cumberland with whom I have had an exhaustive correspondence, and the two Bierce brothers contributed to that exhaustive correspondence. In fact, a portion of a letter from Albert Bierce appeared among the endnotes of Gracie's book. And Ambrose wrote Gracie a letter dated, by the way, all the children have names that begin with A. That was kind of a weird thing about that family. Ambrose wrote a letter to Gracie dated March 9th, 1911, that only found its way into a published book in 1998, though subsequently it's been reprinted a couple of times. And it's to this letter that I want to turn now. At first glance, and considered out of context, Bierce's letter to Gracie would seem to offer champions of Bierce, and I would include myself among that. I know I'm not alone here. This letter would seem to offer champions of Bierce many, many familiar satisfactions, as the veteran Bierce undertook to set the younger historian Gracie straight without troubling to do so gently. Including in his first sentence, the bold opening quoting, "I infer that you are really desirous of the truth." Bierce proceeded to deliver that truth, in the process condescending to admonish Gracie about the need for good historiographic sportsmanship. And I'm quoting from Bierce now. "The historians who have found and will continue to find general acceptance are those who have most generously affirmed the good faith and valor of their enemies. All this, however, you of course have considered, but consider it again." Many readers of Bierce know him as so dazzlingly offensive in both senses that they may not always consider how sometimes his aggressive offensiveness also may have functioned to defend his own limitations and shortcomings. Examined a little more closely and in conjunction with other documents, Bierce's letter to Gracie turns out to be not a shining moment of historical instruction, but really something of an embarrassment. First of all, if there was ever a military historian who needed no lecture on how to affirm the good faith and valor of his enemies generously, it was Archibald Gracie on the Battle of Chickamauga. We don't know the nature of all his consultations with Bierce, and it's very unlikely that Bierce would have read everything about Chickamauga that Gracie wrote before he published it. But subsequent letters from Gracie to Bierce, and these are all at the University of Virginia, so I've been lucky, my commute has been short. Subsequent letters from Gracie to Bierce clearly show that Gracie was working strenuously to give full credit where credit was due, as does this representative sentence from Gracie's book, I'm quoting. "This is my first volume. While intended to preserve the truth and record of great deeds, it is also devoted to the memories of those federal soldiers whose records have suffered by most undeserved aspersions cast upon their conduct and character." Bierce, however, saw things differently, and he was warning Gracie against history written by, Bierce's phrase, bad losers. Bierce continued, "Your strange views of," these are all federal generals, "Thomas Granger and Brannan, and some of the events in which they figured are to me so obviously erroneous that I find myself unable to account for them on the hypothesis of an entirely open mind." But the mind, not entirely open, appears to have been Bierce's. When one considers, for example, that Gracie thought enough of his enemies to use a photograph of Federal General George Thomas as his frontispiece to the book, and that for another, with respect to the question of Granger's presence or absence on Horseshoe Ridge during the afternoon of September 20th, click, you can look at your handout for the program and you see who the players are. Granger's presence or absence on Horseshoe Ridge during the afternoon of September 20th, Gracie worked diligently to supplement the OR with extensive correspondence documented in long, I may say long, endnotes. Furthermore, more recent accounts of Granger's behavior after marching his troops to Thomas's support suggest that this balanced statement by Gracie is wholly justified. This statement is, quoting, "After General Granger had performed his great service in saving the Union Army under Thomas by his timely arrival, it does not appear from our study of the records and from our information from authoritative sources that his subsequent services were at all creditable." What seems to have happened is that Granger rode in, saved the day, decided he'd done his business, got off his horse, and started helping the artillery there aim. This is the commanding Major General. This kind of criticism of Granger could have posed problems for Bierce. For one thing, not only was Granger Albert Bierce's corps commander, according to Cousins, the general also helped Albert's battery, quoting, "place his pieces and then set to work aiming and firing them." With his own commanding general pitching eagerly into the same gritty work he was doing, how could Albert Bierce avoid the conclusion in his unpublished letter to his brother dated March 29, 1911, quoting, "I believe there were some officers in high command who did not do their whole duty at Chickamauga, but Thomas, Granger, and Brannan were not in that class, surely." That Granger might have been better employed closer to his own troops, extending the precarious Union right on Horseshoe Ridge, does not seem to have occurred to either Bierce. For another thing, criticism of Granger could have taken some of the shine off Bierce's happy distinction of a discoverer. Bierce writes in a piece called non-fiction piece called A Little Chickamauga that it was he, Bierce, who turned around and saw Granger riding up to Snodgrass Hill and alerted everyone else. It's a great thing to be the discoverer of a hero's approach, not such a great thing to be the discoverer of someone's approach who then is less than credible. A second questionable aspect of Bierce's letter to Gracie involves place naming and topography. So here comes the part about the ground now. Place naming and topography, Bierce's specialty as a topographic engineer, as he was quick to remind Gracie with his credentials. Quoting from Bierce, "I passed almost the entire afternoon at and near the Snodgrass house, but with nothing to do but look on. And as a topographical officer with some natural interest in and knowledge of the lay of the land." The point in question was the identification of the three-hill ridge to the south and west of the Snodgrass house. This is Bierce again. "Hazen's fire was at no time directed toward what I think you call the Horseshoe Ridge." Then after another intervening sentence, Bierce continues, "The ridge immediately south of the Snodgrass house, I do not know if that is the one that you call Horseshoe Ridge, was at no time until after nightfall occupied by the Confederates, nor was any other part of the ridges that our forces held." Here's my first point. What these two sentences show is that Bierce's credentials as eyewitness to events on Snodgrass Hill did not also make him a thorough reader of writings about the events there. In fairness to him, the ridge now designated as Horseshoe Ridge on most recent maps of the battle did not have that name at the time of the battle, or Bierce most certainly would have known it. It was the Battle of Chickamauga that christened this particular topographic feature, as so many other battles produced so many other capitalized names of type of topographic features on other fields in both the eastern and the western theaters. And of course you know this. I mean, that was not called the capital P, capital O Peach Orchard until after Gettysburg. But when did the name emerge? This is the point. Cousins comments, "From the Snodgrass Hill west to the Dry Valley Road was a series of hills and ridges that after the battle became known collectively as Horseshoe Ridge." But how long after? Was it in 1911 when Gracie took a long paragraph's worth of pains to warn his reader against the pitfalls of nomenclature? Quoting, "Let him not be misled by any such general terms as Snodgrass Hill or the Snodgrass Hill line. Instead, let him use the term Horseshoe Ridge." If this moment marked the birth of the name, certainly Bierce could be excused for not knowing it. But it did not. Now you can refer to your handout. The name Horseshoe Ridge appeared in Granger's reports of the battle dated September 30th, 1863, and his handling of it within quotation marks showed the freshness of the designation. Quoting now from the OR. At about 1 p.m., I reported to General Thomas, his forces at that time stationed upon the brow of and holding a horseshoe ridge. The enemy were pressing him hard in front and endeavoring to turn both of his flanks. To the right of this position was a ridge running east and west and nearly at right angles therewith. Upon this the enemy were just forming. They also had possession of a gorge in the same, though when they were through which they were rapidly moving in large masses with the design of falling upon the right flank and rear of the forces upon the horseshoe ridge. We can't know for sure, though perhaps we can imagine, when the moment came when the first soldier or officer pointed to the ridge line and compared it to a horseshoe. But we can and we do know that the name was in official circulation 10 days after the battle. Again, in fairness to Bierce, he could not have had access to Granger's reports in the OR until 1890. But that date still would have given him 21 years until his correspondence with Gracie. Meanwhile, Granger need not have been Bierce's only source for the name. Federal Brigadier General John B. Turchin, 3rd Brigade, 4th Division, 14th Army Corps, used it throughout his 1888 book, Chickamauga, for example. And 7 years later, it appeared in Boynton's Historical Guide to the newly created National Military Park. Whatever the written antecedents of the name Horseshoe Ridge, one can't help wondering what a self-described topographical officer with nothing to do but look on in the vicinity of two generals, Thomas and Granger, was doing with his natural interest in and knowledge of the lay of the land, if he was not seizing immediately on every scrap of newly minted nomenclature adhering to the lay of that land. But behind this wondering looms a larger question about Bierce and his ways of writing and judging the writing of history. And if you only remember one thing about this talk, I would nominate the next sentence. So I always do this to my students so they stop Facebook for just a second and look up. But behind this wondering looms a large question about Bierce and the ways of writing and judging in the writing of history. And here it is. Is it enough to have been there? Is it enough to have been there? We put a high premium on eyewitness accounts. But is it enough to have been there? In his letter to Gracie, he assumed the posture of affirming that it is, and many of his readers and critics seem to concur, if their ready acceptance of his versions of events is any indication. But Bierce himself has written one of the great passages on the limitations that inevitably circumscribe the perceptions of an eyewitness during a Civil War battle. And the passage appeared in the piece that follows A Little of Chickamauga in his collected works. What I'm quoting from now is a short piece called The Crime at Pickett's Mill, which was ordered by Sherman. The attack was ordered by Sherman during the Kennesaw Mountain campaign. The long passage by Bierce ends with this sentence, and this is the important one. It may be said generally that a soldier's knowledge of what is going on about him is coterminous with his official relation to it and his personal connection with it. What is going on in front of him, he does not know at all until he learns about it afterwards. A soldier's knowledge of what's going on in front of him is coterminous with, substitute, bounded by, coextensive, bookended by his official relation to it and his personal connection with it, and he doesn't know what's going on until he learns about it afterwards. To think otherwise would be naive, and there was something uncharacteristically naive about Bierce's response to Gracie, who had clearly read much more about Chickamauga than Bierce had. How did a Civil War soldier learn afterward about what had gone on in front of him? He read. Bierce read too, of course, but his letter to Gracie showed that he read rather selectively. One of the things he did read, and now I'm moving into the second part of the talk, one of the things he did read, which he mentions twice in his letter to Gracie, was Confederate Lieutenant General Daniel Harvey Hill's Chickamauga, the Great Battle of the West, first published in Century Magazine in April 1887 and reprinted in the third volume of Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, 1888. In his first reference to Hill's account, Bierce pointed to the Confederate general as an example of a good loser of the war, and with reference to the Battle of Chickamauga, the good winner, someone who pays the tribute of admiration to some of the men whom he fought. In the second reference, Bierce concurred with Hill on the time of Granger's arrival as about 2 hours later than the 1 p.m. time in Granger's official report. But although Hill's account contains much of undisputed value for the student of Chickamauga, Bierce again appears to have been somewhat naive in holding Hill up as the standard of judicious and accurate historiography. Moreover, and here's what I really want for the second half, a closer look at Hill's account sheds some light on Bierce's own writings about Chickamauga. Whatever else one can say of Hill's battlefield record, which, as you know, included his leadership in Bloody Lane at Sharpsburg, Antietam, one cannot say that the Battle of Chickamauga was his shining hour. And whatever else one can say about his account of Chickamauga, one cannot say that Hill's account was free from all taint of bad losing. In the case of his contribution to Century Magazine, Hill did not come across as a bad loser of the war. He came across as a bad loser to Braxton Bragg, who after the battle requested that Hill be relieved from duty, as he subsequently was. For all its other virtues as a piece of historical narrative, some of which clearly impressed Bierce, as I'll show you in a minute, Chickamauga, the Great Battle of the West, was about blaming Bragg for failure. Quoting from Hill, "As the failure of Bragg to beat Rosecrans in detail had been the subject of much criticism, it may be well to look into the causes of the failure." Not surprisingly, Hill's account did not receive much attention in Gracie's book, which mentioned Hill only once in 450 pages, and which cited his article only 4 times, once to correct it, since Gracie's judgment of Bragg's performance differed greatly from Hill's. I'm quoting from Gracie now. "In the course of my study, however, I have awakened to the fact that whatever may have been his faults before or immediately after the Battle of Chickamauga, there is no evidence in the official records of any action or order of his, particularly on September 20th, which I can find deserving of anything but the greatest of praise. The worst that can be said against him is that he was unfortunate, therefore unsuccessful as a leader." Some of us may feel that this assessment lets Bragg off too easily, but recent historians of Chickamauga confirm that having Hill as your subordinate was among Bragg's misfortunes. Glenn Tucker asserts that Bragg was poorly served by Hill, who before the battle failed in Bragg's judgment to bag Negley and McLemore's Cove. Cousins judges that Bragg erred both in giving Polk only oral attack orders on the night of the 19th and then in failing to see that they were implemented, and gives Hill's account the last word in his book. But he also points out that Hill was a sulker who carried out his orders, quoting, "with the energy of a sloth." Although students of Chickamauga may apportion blame to Bragg and Hill in different proportions, if blaming is what they are inclined toward, no informed student of the battle can now see Hill, in his capacity as general, as trustingly as Bierce did. But here's what's important. In his capacity as writer, Hill deserves more attention, particularly with respect to the visible effects of his writing on Bierce's own treatments of Chickamauga. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to try and show you how Hill helped Bierce stain the stained glass through which we look when we look through Bierce's writings. One can make different arguments about the timing of Bierce's Civil War writings. In 1888, he published 8 pieces, in 1889, 6, and these 2 years rank first and second in his output of material about the war. As you know, there are lots of veterans reunions going on at this time. This is also when the effort to have Chickamauga made a national military park is going on. So these could have been stimuli for Bierce's writings about the war. But whatever the promptings that pushed Bierce to write about Chickamauga at this particular moment, he, Bierce, still needed to figure out the way to write his versions of history, and it appears that Hill helped him do so. Now I'm referring to that classical piece of writing on your handout by Lucian, Ways to Write About History. In the Way to Write About History, Lucian advised the historian that his attention should be for the generals first of all. Now, of course, we have a counter-movement in Civil War history these days, where, as with Pete's talk, we look at the common soldier and look up. But Lucian, classical author, says, pay attention to the generals, that's what matters. And Bierce seems to absorb that suggestion. The only generals Bierce would have heard during Chickamauga would have been Union ones. But 25 years later, he read Hill's narrative. And in that narrative, he would have heard the tones of a kindred spirit. One who admired many of the same qualities that Bierce did, and one who taught Bierce ways to show his admiration in the manner of a West Point professional. And this is what's key. Take, for example, Hill's description of Longstreet's breakthrough at the Brotherton farm during the late morning of September 20. I'm quoting from Hill now. Discovering with the true instinct of a soldier that he could do more by turning to the right, he disregarded the order to wheel to the left and wheeled the other way. Hill's reference to the true instinct of a soldier not only praised and endorsed Longstreet, a fellow member of the West Point class of 1842, it consolidated Hill's own authority as someone in a position to recognize and determine what constitutes true soldierly instinct in a general. Neither a general, nor a professional, nor even a college graduate, Bierce struggled, according to one biographer, with feelings of inferiority in relation to West Pointers all his life. And Hill's rhetorical move still reverberates with a confidence and authority Bierce apparently coveted. In his depictions of Granger marching toward Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga, Bierce used versions of Hill's formula twice. First, in A Little of Chickamauga, and next in War Topics, published in the San Francisco Examiner 2 weeks later on May 8, 1898. In the former, he described Granger as, and I'm quoting, moving soldier-like toward the sound of heavy firing. And in the latter, the phrasing was even closer to Hill's. As, I'm quoting, as to who saved the army there can be no two intelligent opinions. It was saved by the superb obstinacy of Thomas and the soldierly instinct of Granger in marching toward the sound of cannon. Necessarily limited by his relatively low rank in the chain of command, and consequently by the restricted scope of his understanding, a young lieutenant's opinion, that is Bierce, a young lieutenant's opinion of his poor commander could not necessarily carry on its own the same ring of unquestionable authority that Bierce established here with the help of Hill's professional tone. As though, like Hill on Longstreet, Bierce were praising his peers rather than his superiors. Hill's narrative of Chickamauga contains many other tones and rhetorical flourishes that anticipated Bierce's war writings and may sound familiar to many of his readers. There was, for example, the dryly civil understatement, of which Bierce is a master, the dryly civil understatement of Hill saying, "My interview with General Bragg at Chattanooga was not satisfactory." The praise for coolness under fire, which Bierce also mastered, specifically with reference in Hill's case to Bushrod Johnson, and moments of amused irony, of which you know Bierce is a master, such as this description of Federal General Crittenden, which appears to consist of more praise for cool heads, but turns instead into subtle mockery of the kind that Bierce came to master. And here is Hill on Crittenden. Surely in the annals of warfare there is no parallel to the coolness and nonchalance with which General Crittenden marched and countermarched for a week, with a delightful unconsciousness that he was in the presence of a force of superior strength. Do you know Bierce? You know that could be a sentence right out of Bierce. As for the faculty of expression extolled by Lucian, the classical writer, Hill's narration also provided models of compelling rhythmic variations, whether in the use of short sentences or clauses to puncture and deflate, a technique Bierce also employed. You might think, for example, Hill has a phrase, da-da-da-da-da-da, but Bragg had other plans, and Bierce has a similar moment, da-da-da-da-da-da, Chickamauga was a fight for a possession of a road. Or in the alternation of specific details of battle with sweeping, authoritative-sounding generalizations about leadership and warfare, such as a sentence by Hill beginning, "The one thing that a soldier never fails to understand is victory." Or the sentence, "The great commander is he who makes his antagonist keep step with him." Compare with these magisterial statements and pronouncements Bierce's dicta to Gracie about good historians, or the statement about eyewitness perspectives in the crime at Pickett's Mill. Given the blind spots we have discovered in Bierce's view of Chickamauga, part one of my lecture, we might think that a more circumspect, qualified tone would have been appropriate for his letter to Gracie. But a circumspect, qualified tone would have not become the voice of military professionalism that Bierce admired in Hill. And this voice of military professionalism was the voice, or one of the voices, that Bierce worked hard to develop in his war writings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to close with an anecdote from the archival work I was able to do on Bierce's letters, just to clinch this last point and move towards closure. Bierce's admiration of the authoritative voice of high-ranking military professionals gives the lie to easy descriptions of Bierce as an anti-war cynic. And let me use this anecdote to show you why I think so. 20 years after his active period of writing on Chickamauga, and 3 years before his correspondence with Gracie, on September 25th, 1908, when he lived in Washington, D.C., Bierce wrote a letter to the Adjutant General of the Army. A letter that the Adjutant General then referred to Brigadier General William Wallace Wotherspoon, President of the Army War College. Wotherspoon's side of the correspondence soon makes it clear that Major Bierce had been brevetted Major by an order of March 13, 1865 for distinguished service during the war. That order is signed by Andrew Johnson and Edward M. Stanton. Major Bierce had written the Adjutant General seeking an opportunity, and I'm quoting, to explain and illustrate his theory and system of giving oral commands. In his letter of September 29, 1908, Wotherspoon invited Bierce to come to the War College at 1:30 p.m. Saturday, October 3rd, and either lecture or explain and illustrate before the officers connected therewith your theory and system. 6 days later, in a letter of October 1, 1908, the general expressed gratification at Bierce's acceptance of the invitation, invited him to a very simple luncheon, which we take daily at 12:30, and told him his talk could be just as informal as you please. Subsequently, in a letter dated October 16, 1908, answering a letter of Bierce's dated 3 days earlier, Wotherspoon summed up Bierce's apparently successful visit to the Army War College, quoting, "Both I and the officers who listened to you were so convinced of the correctness of your position in all respects as to deem a field demonstration as unnecessary." According to biographer Walter Neal, I'm quoting Neil, Bierce said that he thought oral commands in the field should be given slowly in rolling tones as carrying several times farther than sharp and crisp orders. From this sketch, which Neil gives in the course of illustrating Bierce's sense of inferiority with respect to West Point officers, one may infer that Major Bierce went to the Army War College to demonstrate the giving of orders in slow rolling tones. One might hear in Wotherspoon's third letter either the genuine endorsement of someone wholly convinced by Bierce's demonstration, or the polite but firm refusal to humor the old veteran any further. Bierce would have been 66. Either way, whatever you decide there, either way, what is significant and revealing about this incident is that late in his life, Bierce identified so clearly with the Army, with the officers of the Army, and with the giving of orders that is their responsibility and power. Wherever it might have come from, Bierce's identification with order-giving officers challenges any reductive description of Bierce as so embittered and so appalled by his military service that his attitude towards the military and toward the war-waging function of the military turned wholly toward revulsion and cynicism. On the contrary, this anecdote shows him near the end of his life still preoccupied with shaping a voice of commanding authority, just as occupied as he was 16 years earlier when he directed his young disciple, to the ancient historian and classical author, to tell her how to write history. Thank you very much. Okay, yes, if you have questions, please feel free to step forward and I'll see what I can do. Yes, sir.
David Rosen of Alexandria, Virginia. What do you see as the relationship between Bierce, the imaginative writer, and Bierce, the aging observer?
What do I see as the connection between Bierce, the imaginative writer, and Bierce, the aging observer of history? Good. Okay. The Bierce, the writer, where we just do the math, Bierce, the writer, doesn't get going really until he himself is in his late 40s. That's not aging, let us all hope. But he's not writing, he doesn't write during the war. He doesn't write anything that's published during the war. So he starts writing in the late 40s, his late 40s. He writes through the end of the century and then things turn. What I would say is that there are two Bierces, two Bierce writers. If you want to follow up on Bierce, I would recommend to you a little book called Ambrose Bierce's Civil War. And the first half of it is his nonfiction writings, a little What I Saw of Shiloh, a little Chickamauga, The Crime at Pickett's Mill. And then there are his stories, his famous stories. My sense is that Bierce was a very complicated figure and a man in many ways trapped by certain codes of expression. He very much, as I tried to show you here, he very much admired a military code of expression. And in particular, I didn't do it this morning, but it's part of the chapter. I'm very interested in how Hill described severe casualties. I mean, awful, gruesome casualties, and what kind of understatement he did it. And Bierce picked that up too. Bierce realized that a professional describes awful casualties in a very matter-of-fact, understated way. On the one hand, he wanted that. He wanted that code of professionalism. But on the other hand, as an imaginative writer, I think he found that restrictive. So that if you know the story, the short story Chickamauga, and I don't want to tell you about it a lot because there's a surprise in it. But that story does include a very gruesome wound, and the description of a very gruesome wound that borders on a kind of ghoulish, almost pornographic interest. It seems to me that his imaginative writings are where that other side came out. On the one hand, you had the code of professionalism and understatement. On the other hand, you had this almost, well, in many ways, Gothic interest in violence, which starts very young in Bierce's life. So the relation, to answer your question, I would say the relation is complementary. He needed both halves because the historian in him did not address all the things that he had to say, wanted to say about what he had seen. Thanks. Yes, sir.
John Lustria from Chicago, Illinois. In the writing of history, do you think it's possible to avoid the stained
glass
on the glass?
Yeah.
Do you need, would you say, like a neutral third-party observer to sort of synthesize everything?
It's a great question. In the writing of history, is there any way to avoid stained glass? This is one I lose sleep over. I really do. And my take on this is there are people on a spectrum of skeptics. Right? There are people at one extreme who are so skeptical about the ways we write about events, so skeptical about the objectivity of those ways we write about events, that what they would say, if I understand, is that there really is no such thing as an event aside from the writing about it. I'm not advertising that point of view, but I know it exists. And it produces interesting things, such as if you ever have jury duty, one of the things that the judge might say to you is, do not talk to other members of the jury. Don't do it. Because as soon as you start to talk, you start to judge. Is writing of history possible without judgment? Probably not. If nothing more than you are judging what materials to include and what materials to exclude. That's a hugely important power. The etymological root, the root of the word fiction, right? When we say, if I say to you that's a fiction, you're going to hear that as my saying that's false. But that's not what fiction meant. The etymological root of fiction is shaping, fashioning. There is nobody in this room who's written about the war who hasn't shaped it and fashioned the piece of writing. Let us hope. Even if you've only written a second draft, you've shaped and done it. So even though I'm not so skeptical as to say there's no such thing as an event apart from the writing about it, I don't see how you avoid the stained glass. Even the OR. You go to the OR, you would think that would be pretty clinical. No, everybody's personality leaks through in the OR. I mean, why? Every other word in Custer's dispatches is I. That's not an accident. Lee is famous. I mean, Lee gives the lie to every professor of English who says, thou shalt not use the passive voice. Because Lee was a master of the passive voice, and Lee used the passive voice because he did not want to call attention to his own agency as the person who sets these orders were given and these things were undertaken. Well, who set those? He did. So those are small shadings. Those are small shadings. But here's the test. Just try to take the most literal document you can, or let's say the most literal event. At 12 o'clock, we will go to the dining hall to eat lunch. Do it in English, do it in Spanish, do it in Chinese, and suddenly you will see very quickly that it's impossible to hold the same thing steady all the way through. There are going to be little gradations. You know, if I go to lunch in English, I'm hungry. If I go to lunch in Spanish, I have hunger. It's a small difference, but already the shadings have begun. Come back home. No, I mean it sincerely. I really do. It's an open problem.
Not right now. Maybe if I see you later.
Write me an email, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Could you please comment on David Blake's assessment of how Bierce influenced our Civil War memory?
David Blake's assessment. Is that important in reunion? Base reunion? Is it? Okay. Remind me, please.
In a nutshell, he's saying, as others are writing about the Civil War as a glorious event, he's portraying it as horrific.
Yeah. Okay, good. I was actually talking with Ian about this for a couple seconds ahead of time. I have a lot of affection for David. I see him at conferences. We have a wonderful time. I think that's too simple. And I'll tell you why. Bierce hated fakery. He hated mythmaking that obscured the horrors of war. He was quick to puncture it. So to that extent, I think David's right. But Bierce also loved and admired and, I think, idealized individual portraits of courage, loyalty, stoicism, strength. You can see these throughout his stories and his nonfiction things. So how do you square those? On the one hand, he would have distrusted any grand sloganeering about the glories of war. But on the other hand, he was not so cynical that he did not identify, enlarge, choose to represent attributes that war produces, that war calls upon. And the thing I tried to show you at the end with the thing about the orders, who's giving the orders, is I think he still was very identified with the military. This was not somebody who just became an anti-war pacifist. So, David, yes, plus the other side. Okay. Thank you very much.
Allison has some announcements for us about the book signing, and then we have concurrent sessions all afternoon after lunch.